welcome everyone. A guest today is Ed Glaeser, professor of economics at Harvard. I guess you all know him. I think he's probably the one of the best, I would say, microeconomists of today's economics academia, and certainly I think the best in his generation. And I have been a fan of his work for many years, like since I started studying economics. And today we're going to talk about certain strands of research he has been doing in the past, especially in the past few years. So he's going to do some sort of a presentation on some work he has done, let's say in the past 5 or 10 years, and which I think or we think are interesting. And of course, your contribution is always welcome. So you are encouraged to ask questions or propose like any kind of discussion topic you might be interested in or that relates to Ed's work. So welcome everyone, and I think we can start if Ed is ready.
Absolutely. No, I'm happy to talk. And let me just introduce myself to you. So my core topics are cities. And I've spent my whole life studying cities and studying the economics of cities. And I like the topic of cities because there's not a lot in human existence that doesn't relate to cities. Even farms, in fact, feed cities. So in fact, I can even get myself involved in agricultural issues if I really feel like I have to. Throughout most of my world, I've worked on cities of the wealthy world, both the US and in Europe. About 10 years ago or 12 years ago now, I decided that the most interesting things that were happening in cities were happening in the developing world, and the most interesting things in the developing world were happening in cities. And that caused me to pivot. Then when COVID happened, I pivoted back a bit, and I'm sort of having now remained straddling between these things. There is when I think about urban spaces, I think about a three-legged stool that combines the sort of magic of human interactions, which is the good stuff about cities, the fact that we become more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of human activity. I think about the downsides of density, the traffic congestion and the crime and the easy spread of contagion and everything. And we think about the physical city. And it's a constant theme of social scientists who work on cities to emphasize that the true city is made of flesh and blood, not iron and concrete. And that, while we care about the physical city and while the physical city is important, it's not the real city. It exists to serve the humanity that actually lives in that city. That being said, the physical city is significant. So I'm going to talk about three things, three recent papers. And the first one is going to be about about measuring road roughness in America. And it's the ending message is going to be about the limits on state capacity. And by this, I mean the fact that it is, we often ask our governments to try to do things and they seem to be very weak at actually performing them, often because their level of human staffing is very limited. Or the human staffing that is there doesn't particularly want to adjust. And so that's going to prove as an example of that, and maybe as a cry to action. I'm then going to talk about gender in the city, and I'm going to talk particularly about my work on female entrepreneurship, and that's going to be especially in Zambia. So we're going to move across from the US to sub-Saharan Africa. And then I'm going to go global, and I'm going to talk about a new paper called How Reform Happens, which is going to be a little bit about like a new database on reforms throughout the world. And I'm going to do my best to sort of introduce all of that to you. Is that good with everyone? Everyone happy with this? Am my volumes high? The more people that can turn on your cameras, the happier I will be. So you don't have to turn on your camera. Obviously, everyone should feel free to do what they want to do. But it makes it much easier for me if I could actually see your faces. So and actually get some sense of reaction. One of the things that's been a theme of my work for 40 years is the question of whether or not electronic technologies are going to strengthen or weaken face-to-face interactions and the cities that enable them. I have certainly taken the view throughout most of that time period, and I think I've been largely right, that most of the time improvements in technology, improvements in electronic and other communications technology have actually strengthened the demand for face-to-face interactions rather than weakening them. And I think one of the reasons for that is what happens when you have a new form of technology, be it the Gutenberg press or the internet, is that we move towards a more information intensive society. And as there are higher and higher returns to being smart, higher and higher returns to skill, the advantages of the really intense interactions that come from face-to-face connections become even more so. And we have evolved as a species over millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are really helpful when you're teaching, when you're learning, when you're working with someone, especially as the world gets more complex. And that's just a very hard thing to beat. And so that's one reason why I love being able to see your faces, because it tells me whether or not I'm completely boring you or not. So it's like, for example, Dennis is looking at me like, I don't know, like I'm not sure I'm working for Dennis right now. So I'm going to try harder because I don't think I'm working for Dennis right now. But okay. All right, so let me try sharing stuff, and you should feel free to like interrupt me and ask at any point in time on anything. So, what I'm going to give you is my road roughness paper. I want you to think about road roughness both as a topic in of itself and sort of just a core task for city governments, right? It's a core task that city governments have, that they all have to do it. They have to make sure the roads aren't hell, right? This is an absolutely crucial thing, and let's learn a little bit about that. Oh, you got to let me share. Okay. Wait a minute. No, not to right. It's supposed to be Salon. Okay. People see this? View, slideshow. Okay. Everyone see my screen? Okay. So the what you're seeing here is the American Society of Civil Engineers gives Americans' highway system a grade every couple years. And it's given America a grade of like a D for much of the last 25 years. It was a really bad grade. Um, it gave us a much better grade. It gave us a B minus in the 80s. The problem with the ASCE is that you can actually compare. We actually have measurements of how rough our highways are, not since the 80s, but certainly since the mid 1990s. And they're over there on the right hand side. And those measures are the Department of Transportation for the US sends out trucks. The trucks go at a fixed speed at night, and they have an accelerometer on the truck which measures how much it goes up and down. And so with this, you can measure how bumpy our roads are, and you produce something that's called the International Roughness Index, or IRI. And what this shows is that since the 90s, our roads have gotten a lot better. Okay, and at the same time, ASCE is still giving us a D minus. Now, what this I think highlights is I don't think we can actually trust the American Society of Civil Engineers to give us grades, because they are, of course, a lobbying group that is meant to represent the interests of civil engineers who would love there to be an extra $3 trillion of work in civil engineering. So we need actual measures of roughness. Now, we now know our highways aren't that bad, and they're certainly much better than they were in the past. And that's actually true. American highways are pretty good. But often, certainly when I drive to work every day, the part of my commute that's hell is the commute on the local roads until I get on the highway. Once I'm on the highway, it's perfectly smooth. And the Department of Transportation doesn't measure that, because those aren't paid for by the Department of Transportation. They're paid for by cities and towns, sometimes with the aid of states. And so we didn't have measures of that, or at least we didn't until now. So what I got from a former student of mine who was the chief economist at Uber is for the entire US for August 2021, and for Chicago for a slightly longer period, all of the data from Uber on vertical acceleration. So Uber sends out its cars all over the place. They send back something like 5 signals a second to Uber, and this enables them to measure the bumpiness of the trip. And they've got a proprietary algorithm for like stripping out a whole bunch of things. We then correct for the speed of the driver, and we correct for the driver's car. Essentially, it's all used within driver variation on this stuff to actually figure out a measure which holds stuff constant. And with that, we can measure how rough different roads are with each other. And since it's the roughness is the bumpiness is speed contingent, we're going to, for local roads, we're going to give you the roughness at 20 miles per hour, for arterials at 32, and for highways at 48. And this is a map of Chicago. So the lake is over there on our right-hand side. The rest of the U.S. is on the left. And one of the things that's striking is the extent to which the red parts are so much concentrated in the city as opposed to the bluish parts which are outside. Now, we can do a whole bunch of things which are documenting that this actually captures stuff. So for the roads where we have both IRI from the Department of Transportation and our data, we can show that they line up pretty well, which is what you see here. And we can do other things. This is actually a map of US roughness. And it's for those of you who, many of you may not have driven in the US at all. I have certainly never actually driven myself in Hungary, so it would be surprising. But if you did drive, you would find that the coastal roads are generally much worse. The cities in the coast of America are generally much worse than the interior. It doesn't line up as much with coldness as you would think, in part because there are southern cities like Houston and New Orleans that are terrible. The normal story for that is it's the clay in the soil. And the clay in the soil absorbs water when it rains and then expands and blows it up. We then try to measure, because we're economists, we try to measure how much people dislike the bumpiness, or at least how much Uber drivers dislike the bumpiness. And what we do with that is we ask, how much do they slow down when it gets bumpy in ways that are salient? So any one of you who drives can choose to have a smoother ride, right? You just slow down. It makes it smoother. And by doing that, you pay for the bumpiness with the by reducing your by spending more time. So in some sense, there's a function which you can spend. You're not spending cash; you're spending time. But as long as I know how much you value your time, I can then figure out how much you value having a smoother road. Now, the one trick when doing this is you're going to need to find moments of changes in bumpiness that are really salient, right? So like if you're just driving along, there's a pothole, like you're not going to know to slow down unless you're seeing it ahead of time. You're going to need to know it ahead of time. Now, the beauty is, just inspired by this idea, we have got a lot of town borders, and the town borders are really known to people, and they slow down when things get rougher. And so this is Chicago. This is the speeds and the roughness at the Chicago border averaged over all those borders. And you can see, like, it gets a heck of a lot rougher when you go into the city of Chicago, and the Uber drivers drive a heck of a lot slower on the interior. Not a heck of a lot. They go from 19 to 16 on average. But it's really clear and it's really striking. And so we can do this for the whole U.S. and figure out how much people dislike the road roughness. With that, we can estimate that the median roughness in the U.S. costs about 31 cents a mile. A one standard deviation higher road roughness is about 23 cents a mile. And that our baseline cost estimate is about 75 cents. So that's even at smoothness. And that is both the driver's time and the wear and tear on the car and the gas and all that other stuff. So it's not tripling or quadrupling the cost of driving, but it does add non-trivially. We can then connect this with variables and connect it with the income of the area, the percent African American in the area. And we don't see this as estimating a causal effective race. We just see this as estimating how much worse are the roads that African Americans are experiencing relative to whites. Our estimate is that if you go from 100% white to 100% African American neighborhood, that's associated with about $456 per year additional road roughness costs. Can we not put things in the chat and just unmute yourself and say something if you have a question or something? Because then if there's something in the chat, then I'm going to feel like I need to look at the chat and that's good. Okay, Trey's just putting
it was just a link. Yeah,
that's great. Okay, that's the link. That's great. $456. Now, I have to admit that there are certain ways in which I can be a little bit focused on promoting my own work. The original title of this paper was Measuring Road Roughness with Evidence from Uber, which got exactly zero attention from anybody. I changed the title to Infrastructure Inequality, and we had 60,000 downloads in 2 hours. So it was a very, the decision to focus on. Now, I've written papers on race, so it's not totally unknown to me. But in this case, like we took a paper that was really very technical and we decided to make it about this topic, which people cared a lot about. And I don't see anything to apologize about it. But so those are our estimates. The bulk of that, you can see by comparing regressions 2 and 3 or regressions 5 and 6, either 2/3 in the case of income or like 80% in the case of race is explained by the town fixed effects. So it's not that within the city of Chicago, African Americans are living in such worse neighborhoods. It's that there are a lot more African Americans in Chicago than there are in Evanston, and the roads are much worse in Chicago than there are in Evanston. In general, within big cities, the gradients are pretty flat. Within smaller, wealthier suburbs, the gradients tend to be steeper. One of the differences between those is that in big cities, rich people tend to live in central locations, like, say, for example, Tribeca, which is right near Wall Street. Those places have terrible roads because lots of trucks go on them. And in fact, like the worst part of Manhattan for roads is Tribeca, so which is chock full of billionaires. So that's a different thing. So this is Chicago and New York, and you can see like up here, this is sort of the west side. That's got terrible roads. That does have a fair amount of African Americans living there. Over here, this is the South Side. This is also very heavily African American. I actually learned how to drive in this part of Chicago when I was a graduate student there, 33 years ago. And those roads are very smooth because it's a very empty, like no trucks going there. There's no business there. It's just a residential area, and it's very smooth. This is New York, and you can see down here down here in Tribeca, down in the core areas, those are really rough in terms of stuff. Up here, you also have a lot of roughness in the Bronx. That's going to be a more industrial part of the city, and that's going to give you more roughness. So far, nothing that I've told you has any policy particular relevance. You can use these data and ask how much should you be willing to spend to repave roads. There also are social effects of driving, which are not going to be incorporated by our estimates. So, for example, you should slow down based on your discomfort. But let's say the effect of your slowing down is either to increase or to decrease traffic accidents for hurting other people. That will be an added effect that we don't think our estimates qualify. What is striking in this, and this is just 4 cities, we have 11, is that in 8 out of the 11 cities, there is zero correlation, and just look at Dallas. There is zero correlation between road roughness and the subsequent probability of being repaved, right? We are not in any sense repaving the rougher roads more than we are repaving the smoother roads. In New York, there's a bit of one, although there's still plenty of repaving of relatively smooth roads, right? There's really not much of a thing. And that, to me, is the most shocking thing. And if you ask me what I would do, rather than spending an extra $5 trillion or whatever the ASCE, what I would do to make America's infrastructure better is I would focus on repaving rough roads before we repave the smooth roads. And you may wonder why that is. We did a survey of 120 cities and towns throughout the US to try to figure out why this happened. And what we found out is that, you can see this for Massachusetts, about 74%. It's about 68% for the rest of the US. Towns say that they're repaving less than half of the roads that they want to repave. And what happens is they sort of have a mandate. Many of these towns have a mandate to do every road every X years. They don't get to those roads. They're not very good at targeting what they do. And so it just ends up being kind of random. Often they'll have a visual index. The visual index is only very poorly correlated with the actual roughness. And then they'll have some algorithm on top of that. So, for example, one mayor I spoke to says, oh, I go to the thing on the visual index, but then I've got to do the 4 roads that are around that one because otherwise the neighborhood gets mad at me. So you do all 5 roads at once. And I think that's a larger problem with America. And I'll just end with this, which is we have been a rich place for a very long time. And consequently, we have never thought very hard about how you target limited resources in a time of scarcity, right? And in fact, that's what this is. Like every locality has scarce resources, especially for rebuilding, and none of them have put significant work into thinking about how to target. And so that's my larger message on this work, which is like figure out how to target limited resources and use the information that you have. So that's this paper. And now I'm just going to stop it and open up the conversation for this stuff, and then I'll get ready my slides on gender in the city. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Okay, just raise your hand and
Oh,
Don't
I
even
was
raise your
gonna
hand,
jump
just
in.
unmute.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
well,
mentioned you talked
we can
with
just
mayors. I mean, do you go out? How did you interact with municipalities? To me, this would be very interesting, I think, for most municipalities and small governments.
So I've given this in a lot of places. The problem is more uh, the problem is uh, there are just a lot of them. So I have a particular relationship. I have a lot of friends who are mayors. So like the mayor of Boston is my former student, and like I talked to the controller of New York with some degree of regularity. I was particularly advising the town of Fitchburg. So I gave a presentation. Oh, Paul, could you mute?
Oh,
Um, the So I got involved with Fitchburg because the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, Kim Driscoll, is a former mayor and a friend of mine, and she asked me to talk at her What Works Summit, which had a lot of newly elected people in Boston, in Massachusetts, and I gave a presentation which included this as part of a soupçon of things that I do, and the mayor of Fitchburg asked for help, and I said, yeah, I can get you a team of Harvard Kennedy School students who are going to help you figure out how to make your roads better. So we did a little work with those guys, and I advised this team, and we're trying to get to sort of a set of things which are useful for more cities at the same time, and trying to figure out how to make that better. So, yeah, I mean, I had when I stopped being, I was chair of our economics department until 2 years ago. It was just for 3 years. But when I stopped doing that, I decided, I'm 57 years old. I want to figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. And like I have these 5 things that I want to do with the rest of my life, one of which is public sector efficiency, mostly in America, but I'm also interested in other stuff as well. It also includes, climate change in the developing world cities, but I don't know how to fix. That's the one that I actually don't know how to fix at all. And I'm only interested in climate change adaptation in developing world cities because mitigation, the reducing the carbon emissions, like the economics of that are quite transparent. The problem is the politics are difficult, and that's not a place where I would have like particular comparative advantage, right? The economists will all tell you, you want a carbon tax, and on top of carbon tax, you probably want some funding for research in this area, and those things are, everything is going to be a second best or third best or fourth best thing relative to those. And so I'm not that interested in figuring out how to negotiate the difficult American political space that actually gets you to something around carbon. Whereas I'm quite interested in figuring out what to tell to Cape Town about how people aren't going to die when you either have heat or water that goes out of control. So that's another one of my topics. I also do housing supply in the U.S., which is actually a non-trivial part of my world. But I'm not going to inflict on you housing supply in the U.S. It feels too far away from your space. Whereas I think road roughness tends to be a fairly universal thing.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little more on that same question about the municipalities, and I guess in particular, like the relationship
Is
between.
that Budapest in back of you, David?
no, it's
Where,
Jenkintown, Pennsylvania.
oh, excellent. Hi, how are you?
we have people from everywhere here, I think.
Oh,
So
amazing.
like
So people should actually tell me.
including
Actually, that'd be great if you would tell me where. So, Victoria, where are you sitting right now?
I am sitting in a western suburb of Minneapolis called Plymouth, Minnesota. And
Oh,
just, I
amazing.
mean, yeah, so the other thing, just to add on that municipality, there's always big discussion whether garbage collection should be publicly by the municipality or have four different trucks from different sanitation companies come through the neighborhood. So that road roughness, wear tear on the roads, that would aid those municipalities in that discussion. So that's what came to mind from a practical standpoint.
For sure. And you know what else? Municipalities can put accelerometers on those trucks, either if they're directly owned by them or in the if they're contractors, and they could actually use that to give them real-time data on roughness. But yeah, sanitation trucks cause a big mess. I have very strong views on privatization, which is I agree with Deng Xiaoping that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, which means that like I believe in being ruthlessly pragmatic about whatever works. So when I say I have strong feelings, it is first ruthless pragmatism, which is you need to figure out in this particular setting, is the private or the public variant going to be better? Because there just isn't a universal rule about this one way or the other. And so I got no idea what's going to work better in your context. Um, the I mean, there's a certain sense in which like city management needs to be ruthlessly pragmatic. That like ideology just doesn't have very much place in actually helping cities to be functional.
Correct.
yeah.
And
And
it
Marcus,
does.
you wanted to ask.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I think Marcus wanted to ask something.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm currently in San Diego, but I'm traveling around the US all the time. But yeah, the relationship between like the municipality, the private institution of Uber, and the academia and the researchers, like I could imagine Uber wanting to be like stingy with their data. Like if I was like city of Tampa, like could I go to Uber and try and get this data and run similar research? And like I thought this paper you're talking about is very, very clever. Do you think that municipalities like typically have a research like wing or have the capability to like come up with novel data sources like this, or like they looking for people like you and what you're doing? Like what's the relationship between all three of
I-
those?
In city government, uh, capacity eats policy as a light snack. And I'm obviously playing off the management consulting culture eats whatever it is strategy.
Yeah.
And it's you walk into a mayor's office and you have 150 great ideas, and the mayor is drinking from a fire hose, and she's got three people who she can rely upon to do stuff. So adding extra tasks like this is close to impossible. Which is why I approached Fitchburg with I brought capacity in the sense of a whole bunch of Kennedy School students there. I think it is possible to imagine um, at the state level trying to deliver some aid for localities using state level capacity. So all states have departments of transportation. Um, they should have some ability to provide aid on this. Uh, and like Uber, like I bet if the mayor of San Diego decided to make this a priority in terms of their bargaining with Uber over stuff, my guess is they could get them out of it. But it wouldn't be free, and it's not free for Uber to do this. And there's a question of like how much, how often, what would you like? Are we talking about 1 week here? Are we talking about they want the whole year continuous monitoring? It's probably cheaper to get there. Are a lot of municipal employees, it's probably cheaper to have the municipal employees turn on these accelerometers with some degree of like regularity. You can probably anonymize them, to make it so that like you're not actually tracking your employees and they're driving around. And certainly they can turn them off when they're leaving the city. You could also create a thing that like you get lottery tickets for based on how many miles you drive this thing, and then the lottery tickets give you something like breakfast with the mayor if you win the lottery or something like that. So you could try to sort of deliver the capacity, but you're always right to worry about that. And academia, like, there's much more free capacity in academia, in part because like our organizational structure is so weird, and you just have a lot of people who are, I mean, most of us are crazily busy, but we also we're I mean like the defining characteristic of a university is it's essentially the inheritor of a medieval guild of teachers that's merged with an independent entity that guards the capital, that guards the money. Okay, and that's the sort of fundamental structure. What that guild does is that we have an amount of freedom that is unlike any other organization. Like, what other organization has middle managers who routinely go to the press to criticize their boss, viciously? That happens in academia all the time, right? What other organ like it's not an issue of nonprofits versus for profits. There's nobody in the Ford Foundation who's like going rogue and like dissing Heather Gerson to the New York Times. That will happen with Harvard faculty members all the time. There's a Columbia professor who in 1916 wrote a book called Universally Control, which is basically 400 pages about why I hate my boss, Nicholas Murray Butler. Okay, this stuff happens. Now, the upside of that, the downside of this is universities are often dysfunctional and they're full of people who get in fights with everybody, right? Let's not forget, like the Protestant Reformation brought to you by university professors, right? I mean, Martin Luther, Wycliffe, Huss, all of them university professors, like picking fights with everybody. On the other hand, the upside of this is that universities attract people who are deeply curiosity driven at their best. And that means that even if you're crazily busy, if like some data opportunity falls into your lap and it's the right person, like, oh, great, I'm just going to drop everything and work on roads in Fitchburg because I'm excited by roads in Fitchburg because like I'm curious about it. That happens in universities. There are very few functional organizations that will say, oh, I'm just going to pivot a high-end employee to work on roads in Fitchburg because she's interested in roads in Fitchburg. Like that doesn't happen in most companies. So that's why we can be a strength for and provide capacity sometimes. Other questions or comments?
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, I'm a retired transport economist, and in my retired years, I've been doing a number of things, including serving as an elected official in my local government here in Jamestown,
Amazing.
Pennsylvania, which is an inner ring suburb of Philadelphia. So
Uh-huh.
we have some sort of heavily traveled roads running into Philadelphia that connect Philadelphia to the outer suburbs. So we have those kind of traffic issues. However, most of those roads are state roads, so the maintenance falls to the state, and scheduling it can be a challenge because of the volume of traffic.
Hmm.
But our municipal roads, we have the sort of schedule you described. I think we have a 10 or 15 year cycle where we try to hit every road and do a repaving, within that time frame. We usually do that with state grants for the most part, which
Yeah.
means the amounts vary from year to year. So we have to be cognizant of how much we have available to spend. I would say by and large, it's done, say, 80 or 90% on just sort of a regular schedule of locations. But if there's some place that really needs attention, we'll try to give that attention in particular. But when you're doing the contracting and the bid design, it's best to have most of the work you're going to have done in a year contiguous to in an area. You don't really want to do an intersection over here and an intersection over there, just because that's financially less efficient. So there are a lot of factors that go into this.
That's
Go
right.
ahead.
So yes, I agree with that. Although it's hard to think why, like, it's hard to understand why anybody is repaving the smoothest roads in the city, and that happens a lot, right? So I understand that, like, there are other. I understand no one expects this to be perfect. And to be clear, like, the actual paper does a bunch of things that are more sophisticated than what I showed you. It's also true that, like, our catchment areas aren't actually street by street. Our catchment areas are slightly larger than that. And so, like, we've got a whole algorithm for dealing with that in different ways. So it would be a reasonably continuous thing. And one way of thinking about it is they're not choosing the catchment areas that are the roughest catchment areas at all. They're often capturing, like, the smoothest catchment areas. But I'm not saying anything about. I don't have your city in our data on repaving, so I'm not. You may do it perfectly. I'm not in any sense pushing back on anyone. And
Well, another factor in it for us that may be hard to capture is that because we're sort of on the way to the city for a lot of people, we have a lot of drivers who cut through our suburb to avoid congestion on the major roads. So to some extent, residents value
yep,
rough roads. So
Yep.
there's that side. You want to discourage that kind of cut through as well, which is
Yep.
a completely different kind of factor.
yep.
It all
That
the
also
time.
happens. Absolutely. I think that's less likely to be true within a big city. And most of our data is large city rather than suburbs like yours or mine. But it is certainly true that, like, I live in a suburb that's not that different than yours, and certainly there are plenty of neighbors who don't want smooth roads for people in other areas to commute. Let me tell you, 20 years ago, there was a discussion about whether or not we wanted to make a bike trail that ran through at the level of NIMBYism of, like, no, those guys who are in the right town over who are functionally identical to, like, everyone who's here. We don't want them taking their bikes on our trail. It was just mind-boggling in terms of the level of, and that's bikes. That's not even driving commute drives. Like, we didn't want the Wayland people taking their bikes in.
I was just in Montana and learned this is my first time there. I'm new in the US. And I just learned that the local NIMBYism is about how the mountain water will run out if there are more people. And I'm like, it's a glacier. Like, the amount of people you would need for that to run out is just crazy.
Water is regularly, there's a thing, maybe somebody who's an engineer knows this. The water question that I have in the US is frequently, like, water is not an issue in Montana. That's ridiculous. Like, water is an issue in Phoenix and in some parts of California. But if you're on the coast, so our friend in San Diego, like, you should not have a water problem because, in fact, desalination is not very expensive relative to what it costs Americans to do stuff. The desalination, like, maybe 5 years ago when I was running through, it's like $300 a year to have all your water desalinated for a year for the average American household. And of course, in California's case, if you didn't do so much, like, essentially free water to the farmers, you wouldn't have a water problem. Now, what I don't know is the shipping costs. Like Phoenix, it's desalination, but you don't have any water nearby to desalinate. And I don't know how much it costs to ship the water in a pipeline from wherever you'd ship it from, presumably someplace in Southern California to Phoenix. That's that one I haven't figured out. So that's I'm remaining somewhat agnostic until I actually figure out how much it would cost to ship the water and desalinate it in. And that's not just that used to be desalination used to be just a Richword technology. Like even I'm good friends with the Cape Town leadership, and they had to deal with the climate change water crisis about 5 or 6 years ago. And even Cape Town desalination is now a feasible technology for much of the city.
There was a good I want to say it was construction physics substack about like reforesting the American Southwest with desalination and piping it up into the desert.
And what
Um
did they say? What's the actually? Uh, I would love to see that link.
yeah, I'll
Uh,
find it. But yeah, I think they were saying like the economic benefit of having all that new land would pay for it many times over.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, I did have another question on the cars. So you did a lot with just Z acceleration and GPS data. I'm curious, like if you got like a year of all Waymo data where you had all the 3D models and the imagery and everything, like what else do you think you would like to look for in that like bigger, more detailed data set?
I don't know. I don't know that I would learn that much more. That I would need to know. I mean, it's obviously interesting to know how much better you could fit. Like the reason why I think like our data is better than the picture data for New York is I've got speeds from my drivers. So I obviously take a different part of the sample than the sample I use to estimate roads to do speeds. But like our measure of roughness is really correlated with speeds. Their PCI isn't correlated with speeds at all, right? And so what I'd kind of like to know from Waymo is if I can predict driver speed a lot better. By the way, the poor man's version of this, if you want to like get road roughness in everywhere in the world, the normal technology is you take nighttime driving speeds on Google Maps. That's the normal technology for getting like how rough it is in Bogota at night on various roads. That's the and the thing that we've learned from this, and this is work by Gilles Duranton and work from Gabriel Kreindler, is that in much of the developing world, the sort of thing that economists have known, David, as a transportation economist, will appreciate this. Economists have been on the congestion pricing ticket for 65 years, since Bill Vickery talked about how important it was for us to price, like charge people for the congestion that they create, right? That's been an economist's favorite thing. I'm all on board. I don't have any problem with congestion pricing, but it doesn't have that much of an impact in much of the developing world because the roads are so crappy that even if it's like the nighttime speeds aren't that fast, so you can't get the roads guys to go much faster because the roads are so bad. And so you've kind of got to do both the congestion pricing and deal with the road roughness if you expect to see Mumbai moving reasonably quickly on this.
I have a comment. I live typically in Tulum, Mexico, and there they are expanding or developing at in different patches. So what happens often is that they'll pave a road, but because there's still other blocks that are not yet developed, all of the construction trucks start running over all the pavement, destroy the roads, and within a year, the once paved roads are now destroyed. What's your take on, how developing countries or developing areas can address that?
You got to keep them off the roads until they're ready to be. I mean, like you got to protect your infrastructure in different ways. I mean, I think there. I mean, one thing that comes out of that is the. I mean, if you had infinite state capacity, you would be charging people not just for the congestion they create, but you'd obviously also be charging them heavily for the roads that they depreciate, which is why we have on highways, at least, we have tolls that go up with weight. That's probably true within, like, you'd probably want to do that within cities as well. I don't know that, like, there's too many developing world cities that could impose that. You can think about quantity limitations, which are generally lower, require less state capacity. And by this, I mean, so for example, Rome under the Caesars had a ban on driving during daylight hours for 8 hours during the day, right? So the first 8 hours of sunlight were banned. That may be more feasible in like in a developing world context or a middle income context than something else. You'd have to figure out how that made sense. Or you could think about like trucks are allowed to use these set of roads, but you're not allowed to use those set of roads. I don't know if the trucks are actually delivering stuff that need to go on all the roads. I mean, that obviously would make that strategy infeasible. But like the sort of simple quantity restrictions are a way of dealing with limited state capacity. And the thing I always say when like you always hear from a developing thing that we can't do congestion pricing because like we're too poor and this requires too much sophistication. Singapore did this in 1975, okay? Like Singapore was not a rich place in 1975. It was a very well governed place in 1975, but you don't need to be rich to have congestion pricing. You don't need to be Stockholm, right? You don't need to be London. You can actually be, you can be Singapore in 1975 and still do it.
All right. Any further question about, road roughness before
Well, no.
yeah.
I was just gonna,
Well,
those of us who live in the US went straight to municipalities with your question because that's the organization. But as you bring up like these international examples and also these sort of networking effects, like once you start fixing one thing, then do you benefit by sort of a network interpretation of how to maintain and the roads? And do you see that like in your work that it's useful to try and be flexible with the unit of analysis when you interpret the
Oh,
results from roughness?
totally, totally. I mean, and this is even like roughness is a fairly technocratic issue. I'm more the areas of the areas of federalism become really front and central for me on my work on housing supply. So my housing supply work is very much about local, local limitations on housing supply are, making us produce much less, making housing very unaffordable, stopping the growth of the parts of America that are most productive. And I've been writing about this stuff for a quarter century. And there, it's federalism is everything, right? So the rules are by and large made at the local level. The federal government has wanted since the Clinton administration. I have talked to people in the federal government who have wanted to push back on this. It is very hard for the federal government to push back on this. It is possible to do stuff at the state governments, and so I think in some sense the front line of this is the California state legislature. That is, in fact, the front line of the battles over housing supply in the United States. And there, you've always got to talk to everybody, right? You've got to know what's going on at the local level, which means you've got to talk to them. You're not going to convince. I don't know about your suburb, David. You're certainly not going to convince anyone in my suburb that you want to start permitting a lot more housing, particularly not a lot more high density residential stuff. That's not a thing my neighbors are. They're not crazy about the bikes from Wayland. They're certainly not crazy about any large things. I mean, I'll make fun of them for having like two things next to each other, Black Lives Matter with Stop the Weston Whopper, which are like, just the ideological oddness of this combination. I enjoy mocking that, but I'm not going to persuade anyone here to do this stuff. You can have victories in the state legislature. That's where things are matter. And I was just very involved with the Build Now Act component of the legislation that just became law here with Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, which creates very weak financial incentives tying community development block grants to building at the local level. And so that's an example. You can try to use federal cash to induce localities to build. But like it's a very, very small thing. And the thing that you would do if you wanted to really create strong incentives is you tie state transportation funding from the feds to building at the local level, which would require the states to take some action on this. That, it turns out, is impossible to do politically because the committee that owns the housing topic in the Senate is Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And if they're trying to use transport money, that goes to the Transportation Committee, and that doesn't work. You can't use a tool from one committee to solve a problem that sits with another committee. So that's an American political thing. That would not be true, let's say, when I've talked to UK leadership, it's much more plausible, both because the national government has control over everything local, and they don't have the same. They have a much more unified government in terms of legislature and executive than we do in the U.S. So I think before I do gender, I think I'm going to show you a couple of other things. I think first, let's see if I can just pull this. I'm going to share this. these are just some fun things. And just for your amusement, let's do this one. You don't need this stuff. You don't need this. This is kind of good. Okay, let's start here. Okay, so let's do this one. So this is a thing that is on the left-hand side. You see the relationship between density at the metropolitan area level and earnings per capita GDP across America's metropolitan areas. So as I go up from a density of I don't know what 6.5 is, but I'm multiplying that by as I go from 6.5 to 7.5, that's doubling, and it's doubling again to 8.5. I have income that's going up by about 40%. 50%. So that's really quite positive thing. On the right-hand side, you have, this is data on upward mobility. This is from my colleague Raj Shetty's data. And he's looking at density in 78, like he's looking at the cohort that was born between 78 and 82. And he's asking where they are as adults in the income distribution. So 42 means that they're richer than 42% of Americans and poorer than 58%. And he's normalizing it. So he's looking at people who are their parents are poorer than 3/4 of Americans in 1980 and richer than 1/4. And what you see from this is the same density that seems to be associated with good outcomes for adults are associated with bad outcomes for kids. Now, I grew up in Manhattan, so I find this all kind of offensive, and I thought it was great growing up in Manhattan in the 1970s. Like, you'd just be walking along the sidewalk, and guys would hit you for no good reason. It was fun. It's good times. But it's certainly true that pretty much any measure you want of sort of urbanity, like being close to the city center, being in a dense neighborhood within the community, and especially being on the big city side of a big city school district line, right? All of those things are associated with very bad outcomes for kids. So I had a hypothesis from this, which is, well, maybe what's going on is that adults and kids experience, like particularly poor adults and kids, have a very different experience of the city. And my hypothesis was that if you are an adult, you may wake up in a poor neighborhood. You may wake up in Harlem or the South Bronx or wherever. I have no idea. I don't know if there are poor areas in San Diego. There must be, but I've never been to them. And you go to work. You go to work at UC San Diego. You interact with elite people. You have a mixed life. Whereas a poor kid who lives in a project goes to a segregated school and they play in a segregated neighborhood. And the question was, the sort of magic of cities clearly comes from mixing. And if you are living a life that's as segregated as living in a rural village, like how are you getting the benefits from the city? So I thought it would be fun to try to measure this. So I have a whole bunch of cell phone data, rather my co-author Cody Cook has, and we tried to differentiate students and kids. The problem is with doing this for adults and kids is that like you don't know whether or not someone's an adult or a kid. You just know where they spend their time. And so fine, I can restrict myself to people who spend much of their week during the year in a school. So that's reasonable. I can get these schools, but the privacy concerns of these people means I don't have anybody under the age of 16 in my data set. Okay, so I'm limited to people who are like 17 and 18-year-old high school students. Plus, I've got in that sample, I've got all the teachers and the custodians and the administrators as well. So I've really got a pretty crappy sample of kids. And yes, the kids experience somewhat more isolated lives than the adults do, but it's not huge. And I don't know if this is because of my measurement or because of something else. But what we did find, which is pretty amazing, is Cody's magic enabled us to match the place where the cell phone slept with the value of the home in Zillow. So we know we link at the value, and then we look at mobility patterns for people who live in expensive homes and poor homes. And what you find here is sort of vastly more mobility among the rich than among the poor. And so we're going from the sort of bottom to the top. And it's the effects are least for what we call civil, social, and religious. That's down here. And they are most for entertainment. Entertainment costs money, so that's not totally shocking. Look at parks, though. That's like a 40% higher park visiting for the rich guys than the poor guys. So it really feels to us that like the rich kids are experiencing just much more. Rich kids plus teachers plus school administrators are experiencing a much more like diversified urban experience. Now, is this just the neighborhood in which they live, or is this something about how they experience their life? So on the other side, we're controlling for the neighborhood that you live in. So we're controlling for the census tract in which you live, and the effects get smaller for sure. Like they're about half as large, but they're still pretty sizable. So you've got about 20% more trips to parks in the richest houses within the same neighborhood than in the poorest houses. And so there really is a different experience of the city that is associated with the rich versus the poor. And I find that pretty interesting. I'm going to give you three more slides, which are from a different paper. This paper was published in Nature Cities. It's part of the Nature family. This one is published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we got images. We got images of, we got movies. We got movies from the 1980s. There's a guy called William White, who, for those of you who are urbanists, he was the man who discovered Jane Jacobs and gave her her first platform. He's also Holly White was what he was. That was his nickname. He also wrote The Organization Man, and he also in the 60s and 70s got obsessed with how people use urban spaces. Thanks to money from Lawrence Rockefeller, he basically was free to take a gazillion movies of people using prominent urban spaces. And then he and his students would like look at these movies and they'd say things about how people are using urban spaces. Now with machine learning, we can actually like measure this in a systematic way. And what we particularly do is we take his movies from the 80s and we compare them with movies that were done in the early 2010s. You could take new movies now. I think they would be slightly different because everyone's looking at their cell phone right now. So we thought that maybe the 2010s might be slightly better. So this is the kind of, so then we're comparing this and we're doing things like looking at speeds. So this is just speeds and we're moving a whole lot quicker than we used to. And these are the four areas. So two of them are in New York. So they're the stairs of the Metropolitan Museum and Bryant Park, which for most of the last 25 years, Bryant Park has been a splendid, nice urban space. In the 1980s, in the great age of my childhood, it was a place where you bought and sold drugs, right? It was not a nice place where you hung out. Downtown Crossing is in Boston, and the other one is Philadelphia. Okay, so for most of them, this is the average speeds. This is the box and whisker chart of the speeds. So we have much faster speeds. In general, like in three of the sites, we don't think there's a huge increase in the variance. In Bryant Park, there's a huge increase in the variance. Okay, and what's happening is like people are using Bryant Park as an entertainment space. And so when they do that, they kind of slow down in Bryant Park. Whereas in the 1980s, you were in and out of Bryant Park. You were doing whatever nefarious thing you were doing and getting out because you didn't want to be hanging out in Bryant Park. That's all I've got on that. So I've got a little bit more on this paper, but I don't seem to have it on this deck. So I think maybe we'll stop here. But it's sort of an exciting time because we can measure things about cities from cell phones or movies or other stuff that we didn't used to be able to measure. And so that's sort of an exciting part of my life, that like there are new ways of measuring how people are using urban space. And in some sense, talking about the dialogue between the humanity that occupies cities and the physical area of the cities. Any questions or comments or things like that? We also have stuff on like how long it takes you before you meet someone, how often you are to meet people. The answer is people are much less likely to meet people, like to meet up in these areas anymore. They're much more likely to be just walking quickly from place A to place B, and they're much less likely to be just like hanging out and meeting friends in those areas. That's also appears to be the change. And there's no policy implication of any of this. One could imagine there was policy that influenced Holly White's work. And the policy was specifically about the zoning rule in the 61 zoning plan of New York that gave you a height bonus for building a plaza. And this, in some sense, Bill, for those of you who know the Seagram building in New York, Seagram is sort of a pioneering piece of architecture. And that's a pre-61 build thing, but it was thought to work splendidly. And so because of that, there was a zoning bonus that put in a lot of plazas. So there were a lot of plazas that were put in. And Lawrence Rockefeller sort of sent Holly White off to figure out how the plazas were being used. And I think the answer is like, and he gave us a lot of information about how the plazas were being used. That's his book, The City, is actually about that. So that's a policy that is directly relevant in that. I have not engaged with the plaza policy. I'm not sure. I mean, my views on zoning tend to be quite simple, which is I'm always in favor of allowing more stuff than we have currently. And this is a line that I attribute to my former colleague, my now deceased Marty Feldstein, going back many decades, that in many policy areas, you actually don't need to know where you want to end up. You just need to know the direction. And so, like, it's not like I need to know if I want things to be full on Houston, i.e., almost no regulations, or something that's more modest. But like, I know I want Massachusetts to be less regulated than it currently is, right? I know I want New York to permit more height in core areas than it currently does, and to make it easier to build more. And so I don't need to solve things like, what's my ideal zoning code, because I'm not going to get anywhere near there. Victoria, you've unmuted yourself, so that must mean you have something to
No, I really like your example of parks, because it's an example where the infrastructure itself isn't necessarily good or bad. It's the way it's used. And parks can attract crime as easily as it can attract very beneficial social interaction. But infrastructure is a permanent object in the city. So if you are going to develop, you need to put parks and trails in initially. At least that's the easiest way to get them done, as opposed to retrofitting. So I think you've made the distinction there between infrastructure and good and bad uses as being separate, and being thought of and observed for policy purposes as separate too.
And high-end infrastructure of this space, high-end open space infrastructure, like, to get value, it actually needs almost constant programming. So like in areas like Boston's Innovation District, which has a bunch of empty space, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, which has ownership essentially of the space, like, puts a lot of thought into how like the various open plazas get used in different ways. In the case of sort of large legacy infrastructure like Central Park, there it's mostly you want to make sure it's reasonably safe. The Bryant Park, which is a smaller and more manageable space, that actually was essentially, I don't want to say privatized, because that seems like we've given it to a for-profit company, but it was essentially turned over to a nonprofit that actually took ownership of it and is responsible for some programming, some safety, and putting it together. And that's worked very well, in part because like you can commercialize some of this to pay for the other stuff. I mean, the like essentially a large pot of space between 5th and 6th Avenues on 42nd in New York, that's worth a ton of money. And so the ability to do events there can be monetized in a way that can fund a lot of safety and a lot of other good stuff for other people. So that worked quite well. But again, like, whether or not you want the city to be managing it or you want a quasi-private entity to be managing it is unclear. If you're talking about full-on privatization, like, you probably want to try it for a lease for a year and see what happens with a lease before you actually think about selling it, because thinking about selling it is a little crazy. And on the privatization front, one of the places where privatization is at its worst is when all you're doing with privatization is you're front loading the revenues. So there's a whole bunch of privatization that Richie Daley did in Chicago, which is basically selling off the right to collect the tokens from the meters. And like, that's just stupid. That's just because you want to spend the money now. It's not that you think that there are any efficiency gains or anything from doing it privately. You just want somebody to give you the cash up front. And that's a really bad reason to change the ownership structure on anything. But thank you for your comment, Victor. You're completely right. Other comments or questions or thoughts on stuff?
Yeah, Dennis here. I have a question. And I'm living
Dennis, where are you?
I'm in Southern California, sometimes in Riverside, sometimes in San Diego, North County. I'm wondering whether you have an interest or have done other research in other areas of infrastructure for cities. Like, do you check to see whether or not the plumbing is backing up more in some areas than others, or maybe that some parts of the city have to get repaired more often than others because maybe they put in inferior structure to begin with, or anything like that. And then I had one comment, which is
so so the answer
Go
is
ahead.
work on stuff when somehow or other data sets end up in my hands. And if someone were to deliver a great data set on plumbing problems in Riverside, I might find a use for that, or at least find a student who is willing to work for it. I have done work on, I've done water work in Zambia. So I do water work in Zambia, and I'm happy to talk about that. But it's not like I'm not like it's a fundamental difference between what I am and what like you would be if you actually worked for a city government, where you're actually responsible for like a lot of city services, and you can't say, oh, I'm only going to do X. Whereas like there's no reason for me to do I don't have to do X. Like I should only work on those things in which I think I can do something which teaches the world something about itself and makes the world a better place. And so I don't feel the need to take on everything. But I'm certainly open. If you got a great access to plumbing data, I'm open on that.
The one interesting city with data that's all over the place is San Bernardino, due to the fact that the city and the county own plots of land within each other's plots of land. So it's this weird patchwork of land, and it results in nobody building things like stoplights because the county wants the city to pay for it, and the city wants the county for it, and is kids get hit on their way to school, and um, it's a mess. It would be the kind of mess that would be probably fun to study if you didn't have to live there.
It sounds pretty fun. No, that sounds great. That sounds quite interesting. I mean, there's a lot about local government in the U.S. which is just hyper local. And you kind of, I mean, like I've done more work on Massachusetts than I possibly should have because I'm here and because I know the players here and because it's reasonably useful for doing stuff. It's not like Massachusetts is that more or less interesting than any other part of America. And certainly California is incredibly interesting. And there are lots of weirdnesses in California. There are also like particular actions of policy stupidity like Prop 13, which are sort of like just extremely dysfunctional things. And it's also true that there are a lot of great economists at UC San Diego, UCLA, Stanford, and Berkeley, many of whom spend a lot of their time working on California-specific issues. So California also gets its share of attention from this. But that sounds quite interesting. That sounds like the interaction. And obviously, for those of you who are not American, like it's not like the states, like what a county does, what a locality does, and what a state does. That's different in every one of the 50 states in the union. Right? In Massachusetts, counties don't do squat, right? In Maryland, counties do everything. Like they run some jails in Massachusetts, they do that badly, right? So there's a very big array of different things, which means that like it's very hard to do cross-state work on things that involve like municipal stuff, like zoning, for that matter.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anna.
Hi, I'm so great to meet you, Ed, and I'm so sorry I had a meeting before this, so that's why I could only join 30 minutes in. Such a pleasure. And Peter and I, we're both from Budapest, and we've known each other for such a long time. So all our comments are always the same, like why we always compare things to Budapest, I think subconsciously or more consciously. I just arrived in LA. This is my first time here. I've spent so much time traveling around America. And it's kind of shocking. I have to say, I don't want to be like, oh, we joined the EU 5 minutes ago and now I have all these big opinions. But, I'm in Silver Lake and this is a good neighborhood and all these Hollywood writers live here and stuff. And like there are no pavements. I'm thinking if you have a baby and you're trying to like push your baby, in a buggy, like, I don't know how people do that. It's just so interesting. And I feel like an alien everywhere, but it's so different.
So this is not true. So let me just the problem is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of neighborhoods. So I, in fact, just had yesterday, I had lunch with a former student of mine who teaches at UCLA. And she was telling me about their neighborhood in Los Angeles where they walk their bike everywhere. Yeah. And so I believe that's Venice Beach where they do like bodybuilding, but I believe in Venice Beach, there are like things where you can walk around, but you have to choose the neighborhood that's your neighborhood. And it's a very fractured thing. And certainly there are great swaths of LA where you're completely right. There are no things that you could.
Oh, they have pavements. So this is supposed to be a walkable place. That's why I'm bringing it up. And it's just broken. So it broke at some point and there's nobody to kind of fix it, I would imagine. But then you drive 15 minutes on and you feel like you're in the future and it's gorgeous. So it's kind of shocking. Yeah.
So you want to think about America much more so than Europe as having rebuilt its cities around the car. or built its cities the first time around the car. Actually, let me echo, this was Victoria's thing. All forms of retrofitting are vastly more expensive than doing things de novo, which is why, like, one of the challenges the older cities had in the era of the automobile was just the retrofitting for the car was a really hard thing to do. LA was a little bit pre-car, but it was sufficiently undeveloped that it was fairly easy to build mostly around the car. And you go to Phoenix or Las Vegas, like those things are all cars, except for this inner ring area in Las Vegas, which is built around drunk people walking from casino to casino. But like other than that area, it's like a completely a car-based thing, and that's just the way America is. In part, this is because of the natural, like if you don't have the legacy assets that European cities have, there's a lot of things that are appealing about the car. I mean, it's on an 20 years ago when I did this, the average car commute in the US was about 23 minutes. The average public transit commute was about 50 minutes. And it's hard with public transit. It's not just like that we've got crappy public transit. It's that, you walk to the, like anytime public transit involves walking when you get there, to wait for it to show up and to get where it drops you off. And so in most areas, it's sort of hard to get down to a 20-minute commute. And yet in most of America, you get a 20-minute car commute. And like that kind of works. And so it's not crazy that Americans chose that. Especially if you're like, if your alternative is Stockholm or your alternative is, okay, I'm not going to choose any particular American cities. There are Midwestern cities in the US where like, you're not saying to yourself, oh boy, giving up on the public transit options in this central city is some, horrific loss for yourself. And so that's also a thing that I think is
it's just strange that it's not repaired. I think that's what, makes me pause, because obviously I'm in a very wealthy place. And you see very old broken pavement in the so-called walk, like people move here because it's supposed to be walkable. And, like a half tree has already grown out of it. So clearly, it has been broken for a while.
They're not actually walking. It's LA. Nobody's actually walking in LA in this area, clearly. It's so there's no public pressure to do it, I would guess.
Right.
I would guess in Venice Beach, they probably, you should go there and decide if that's true or not. But I would guess in a neighborhood where people really are walking, that there's political pressure to fix it when it breaks.
Okay, maybe we can move on to the gender or the reference.
Yeah, I can move on to the gender, sure.
Yeah.
Can I just say one small
Yeah,
thing
sure.
before we move on? So sorry. Which is that like I'm normally within the California region, but I'm visiting Montreal for the summer. And one thing I've really noticed in terms of contrast is that there's a lot of effort to beautify the space, the public spaces in Montreal. And what I mean by that is that like we talk about how, for example, like pedestrians walk a lot slower in and like over the change of data in New York, and you said Boston, right? And though I don't know who linked that cool paper and that said that like part of it is because the indoor cafe has increased, and so more people spending a lot more time indoors at cafes, hanging out with their friends as opposed to outdoors. Okay, and what I see in Montreal is the complete opposite, where it's just like everybody takes a coffee and like finds a place outside to hang out in some beautified space, whether it's cafe or benches or whatnot. And I see that the city is making a lot of effort to do basic things like, what do you call this thing when you like extend the sidewalk so that the cars and pedestrians and cyclists are more visible, but they add more effort to beautify by putting bushes and trees and shrubberies within that as well. And I don't see, maybe like, because my naive eyes don't see it, but I don't see the same beautification sort of attempts in a lot of local governments in California and in general. But I don't know if that's I don't know if you have any quick thoughts about that.
I don't know, but California is a car-based place, and a lot of the walkable spaces that you think of in the US car-based areas are in shopping malls. Right. So there exists this service of providing, I'm going to walk around and I'm going to have like a coffee in my hand and I'm going to sit down and talk to my friends. Like I would guess in most of, we'll take our Minneapolis example. I would guess that's likely to happen much more often inside like the Mall of America than it is in a random street corner in Minneapolis. And so that, I'm not saying that that's good, but that it does tend to be an American thing in the car-based parts of America. Certainly there are, in the summer in Boston or New York, there's plenty of use of the outside space, and plenty of use of like the Boston Garden or Central Park or other spaces. I mean, those areas are fairly heavily used. I don't know about you need to sort of have numbers like movies that would enable you to compare Montreal with the eastern places. But like Montreal is an older city. It's a city that's built around pedestrian traffic and older forms of public transportation. And so it naturally has that in a way that's not going to be true of any place in California, with the exception of San Francisco. I would guess that downtown San Francisco actually has some
Yeah, because I was
some
going to
activity.
comment that San Francisco is like considered one of like the top 10 most walkable cities, I believe. And
Totally.
right? And so it still doesn't seem to have the beautification efforts that Montreal is put in.
Okay. So remember, but San Francisco, like we've got 6 years of sort of San Francisco political dysfunction, which is just starting to fix. So like there was a big period of, we're going to let fentanyl markets sprout up in downtown areas, and we're going to have no rules, and there's the COVID craziness and all this stuff. And I did an event with the chief of staff. This is actually like if one has the opportunity, by the way, to speak to city leadership, you actually don't want the mayor, you want the chief of staff. Unless you want a specialized function, such as whoever's in charge of street stuff. But you want the person who actually makes stuff happen. And they're very focused on quality of life stuff on the streets of San Francisco right now. That's a very high focus for them. Some of it's around safety. A lot of it's around, California has this homeless problem that is very, very expensive to deal with and just very tough to deal with. And that they've got to figure out how to deal with. Montreal, like Boston, has much less of that problem, because being homeless in Montreal in December is not a fun thing. And so the temperature thing is very protective against homelessness at the place level. Whereas California tends to be the mecca in America for homeless populations, and that's why it's particularly hard there. So I think give the guys some time in San Francisco. You're looking puzzled or something, Amy. You're thinking about stuff. But I think you will see more beautification in San Francisco in the years ahead. And certainly you have in various points in the last 25 years. The last 6 years have been quite odd, though. The other beautification thing that you should be aware of is there's a certain amount of like privatization of that in the US in business improvement districts. And so business improvement districts are a type of privatization I have no problem with, because it's not government, it's not business instead of government, it's government and business. So it's saying you have a bunch of business owners in the area who want the area to be cleaner and nicer, and so they're going to pay for the sanitation work, they're going to pay for extra cops, they're going to pay to make things attractive. And generally they have the right incentives because they want people to come to their area. And so they sort of have incentives to make it more attractive. And so like that's one way in which areas have gotten nicer, is the sort of use of business improvement districts in places like the Baltimore Harbor and things like that. Okay. My throat is going, so we'll see how much longer I can keep this up. But okay. But I not managed to share. Let's see.
No, we can see it. We can see your screen ad.
And you can see
female entrepreneurship and market. Yeah.
Okay, you can see it. Okay. All right. So female entrepreneurship in the market, you can see it now. How about if I do this? You can see it now? Okay. So this has been about 6 years of my life that I've been working on this with Nava, who is they're all in different ages. So Nava is a former student of mine, but she's like 45. Alexia is now a sort of young associate professor at Bocconi in Milan. And Kim Sarnoff was a graduate student at Princeton who is now a graduate, and I think she's going to Northwestern. And so we've been working on it's the idea is not totally dissimilar to my point about poor kids moving around the city, except and the core idea here is the advantages of cities come from collaboration. But what if you can't collaborate? Because when you try to collaborate, people abuse you. And this idea comes from, so Nava is an economist. She teaches at the LSE. But she operates almost like an anthropologist some of the time, and that she's done a huge amount of work with women in Zambia, and a lot of work like talking to and learning from female entrepreneurs in Zambia. And so one of the things she talks about is every time she talks to them and she asks them about collaboration, they'll tell her stuff like men are terrible because like if you try to collaborate with the men, they either try to steal your stuff or they try to sleep with you, right? And that makes it sort of absolutely unappealing to do anything like that. And that in some sense motivates this is the idea that maybe women aren't getting the advantages of urban connection because uh, they don't have rule of law or the sort of social protections you need to protect them against men who are abusive. And so the basic ideas here are captured by this. Collaboration is essential to economic life, particularly urban life. Collaboration is risky. There's always the possibility of holdup and expropriation. Asymmetries of social power, including those rooted in gender, can exacerbate those risks. Without protective institutions, weaker parties may hold back from interacting with more powerful partners, with potential losses and inefficiency and growth. And in the US, we have both formal and informal institutions which have tried to make progress on this. It sort of resonated with me somewhat because my mom was for many years the highest ranking woman at Mobil Oil when I was a kid. And that doesn't mean that she was very high ranking, just to be clear. She was hired as an MBA out of Columbia in the 70s. She'd gone back to get a mid-career MBA. And like when I was 9, and like there's a lot of like negotiating a very all-male environment that was pretty unpleasant in the 70s and 80s for a female executive in an American corporation. But over time, we have developed institutions that have made things, I hope, somewhat better. Certainly, it's something in my world in which like I can think of numerous times in which I've had a female graduate student who said, "Oh, I had this co-author who's acting in this kind of jerky way," and like I said, "Oh, great! Just suggest to this person that maybe we have a three-way conversation about this," and the jerkiness tends to vanish immediately after that. And so there are lots of ways which like that doesn't require no disciplinary reviews, no nothing, but just making sure that like there are eyes on the situation and someone who has the capacity to exert some form of social punishment like is around to protect that can be helpful. There are some motivating facts. Let's see if this actually works. Okay, so there's an inverted, about 1 in 3 businesses are owned by women in the World Bank Entrepreneurship Survey, and there is an inverted U-shaped relationship between female entrepreneurship and economic development. Women are much more likely to be leading businesses in middle-income countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. So Share Buddhist is very predictive of female entrepreneurship, or in former states of the Warsaw Pact. Female entrepreneurs cluster into industries, food, personal services, retail, ones that have low returns. And in fact, the gulf between female and male returns in entrepreneurship can be explained largely by which industries women end up in. These female industries tend to be ones where there's lots of scope for female collaboration. Okay. So a fact is that the gender gap in collaboration, I'll show you shortly that women are collaborating in our data much less than men are, it decreases by about 75% in apparel. And there are similar stories for female economists or female scientists. I'm not going to talk about why. More generally, our hypothesis is that women face expropriation in male-dominated sectors, and they choose to self-segregate it into either working alone or working with other women. And so our hypothesis is, does access to contract enforcement institutions enable women to participate in economic collaboration? So in our case, this is going to be market chiefs. I just spent an hour with the team this morning. We're talking about trying to make the small claims court more accessible to women. And our secondary question is, when institutions see gender, does this visibility reduce or reinforce power asymmetries? Okay, so let me show you what we did. Those are our questions. We have a framework, we have survey evidence, and then we have experimental variation in institutions across features. So this is Zambia. There's a high rate of gender discrimination and traditional gender norms. There's limited access to formal institutions. Women say that they don't trust courts, that courts aren't helpful for them. And it's among the lowest trust countries as measured by these surveys in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason, again, going back to this point, like, do you do X? The reason why I work in Lusaka is because Nava is my friend and former student, and she wanted to get me involved. And so I would never have had the patience or the sense to spend the 30 years that Nava has spent, or the 25 years that Nava has spent building up deep institutional knowledge of Lusaka. I'm there because I have a younger co-author who wanted me to get engaged with this, and so I did. One of the things she's done is she's done an amazing census of urban entrepreneurs. So all of the entrepreneurs in Zambia in Lusaka are mapped. We know where they live. We know where they work. Some of them work in what are called markets. And I think we have markets are spread throughout the city, and markets are notable because they have chiefs, and the chiefs operate a sort of rough kind of justice in these markets. We know a bunch of things, including how much cooperation these manufacturers do. They share orders, they joint buy, they lending, they advise. Women are concentrated in the least profitable sectors. So 75% of women work in, this is just the distribution of women across sectors. The male share is about 50-50 in apparel. It's about 75-25 in food manufacturing. Beveraging is down, and then it's just down from there. So very segregated in a few clusters. Women have lower sales than men. So this is just the distribution of female and male sales. Much of that is explained by the cluster. And women's firms are smaller than men's firms are. They have fewer employees. The two genders learn their trade differently. And, there's a line that I love, which is by the great English economist Alfred Marshall, who said that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air, with the idea that people are learning from one another. Well, it's not true for women in Zambia. Okay. Whereas what in the world, Anna, is happening where you are? Is that a dog that walked in front of you, Anna? What walked in front of your,
I am babysitting my cousin and Shane's cat, who is emotionally starved, like nobody spoke to it for like 2 years, but even just after 1 minute. So I think we are dealing with a mental situation, and he's like, I don't know. I gave up. I'm just like going with what.
Of course, that's fine.
Sorry.
No, we're involved. Okay,
you said black cat, white cat, and this cat is both. So maybe that's.
There you go.
Guys.
So overwhelmingly, only almost 75% of men are learning from either another entrepreneur in the business or a family member. If you add on the sort of entrepreneur in another business, you're getting to over 3/4. And the level of formal training is very tiny. Overwhelmingly, women are paying for formal training to do so. It's a very different way of learning, and they're not having the same sort of informal relationships that are actually educating the men who are taking these roles. They also trust much less than men do. So this is just the answer to, do you think most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful? Women are lower in all of this. This is true in Zambia. This is true elsewhere. Okay. This is cooperation, joint buy, lending, getting advice, sharing orders. Overall, women are doing less of this than men across all these areas. Business cooperation is gender segregated. So 54% of women have cooperated with a woman. Only 26% of women have cooperated with a man in our sample. 22% of men have ever cooperated by a woman. 68% of men have cooperated with a man. And 11% of men have partners of a different gender. 18% of women have partners of a different gender. So it's a very different level of interactions. These are just some quotes from a tailor. I don't know this tailor. Nava knows the tailor. Men steal and run away. They drink a lot. It's a challenge with men. I don't like working with them. I had some big contracts for hotel uniforms in the past, around 50 to 100 pieces. I was working with some man. I was going back in the morning to check his work, and he would always be at the same point. That's because men start doing their own jobs when you were not there. So those are the sort of stories you get from the female entrepreneurs. 37% of women in our sample say that a woman may turn down a cooperative opportunity with a man because of the fear of being taken advantage of. Only 13% of women mention the same reasons when turning down an offer from a woman. 16% cite fear of sexual advances when cooperating with a man. Okay. If owed money by another person, 70% of owners say they would complain to the market chief. 17% say they would go to the police. 6% say they would go to the small claims court. Now, the small claims court was meant for people like them, and so that's why we're currently working on trying to make the small claims court more relevant. But the market chief is the key institution. This is an institution which you'd only get to use if you're in the market. It's modeled on traditional African chiefs, and he basically has the power to punish. At the most extreme, he can kick you out of the market. About half of these chiefs are sort of appointed, about half of them are elected, but they all kind of do the same thing. They're involved in dispute resolution. It's what they do. Some of them, notice this. I'm very proud of this. Notice the name. That's the mayor's dad, right? So I actually, before, I didn't even recognize they were related. I actually had read the mayor's dad's book on politics in Africa, before I even knew that they were related to each other. So the market chiefs take on the traditional rural role of chief in a market, in an urban setting. And they do seem to think that their job is often to protect the weak. That is actually a thing. Okay, you don't get this. This is not for you. This is not you do not get algebra. That's not a thing. So this is what these markets look like. So we've got 83 markets in Zambia, and 30% of all businesses are in markets. So this is clearly an apparel market. This is clearly a wood market. They have specializations in things. And these markets are going to have a chief. Women's cooperation is higher in these formal markets. We also we measured the chief's gender bias. We asked questions about the chief. To the chief, we asked questions to the market participants, and so we have measures of whether or not the chief are better or worse for women. Okay, outside the market, you have much less cooperation than inside the market. Inside the market with a chief with a high gender bias, it's actually better than being outside the market, but it's going to be worse than inside the market with a chief with low gender bias. So both the sort of market and the gender bias of the chief kind of matters. We did, to test the causal impact of access to the market chiefs, we ran two what are called artifactual experiments. We did what's called a version of the trust investment game, which is, the way it works is that there's an investor, these are just people who are chosen, market participants, female entrepreneurs. They're given an endowment of 10 tokens, and they can invest these in the trustee's business opportunity. It's all a game. It's all like a made-up thing, but it sort of is meant to feel to them like a real situation they've had. Any amount that is invested is tripled before being received by the trustee, who then decides how much to give back. We're going to randomize the investors, and keep in mind, these investors are all going to be entrepreneurs, male and women. We're going to randomize investors into settings in which I can't actually read this, to be able to complain to their own market chief if they think the amount sent back to the trustees is not fair. Experiment number 1 is a gender blind chief. Okay, we actually originally thought gender blindness was important, and we're following this based on my colleague Claudia Golden's early work on what does gender blinding do when you have auditions for orchestras. And our experiment number 2 is we're going to be gender blind versus gender aware chiefs. And we're going to be asking whether or not the women actually want their gender to be known or not. Okay, so we have entrepreneurs across 16 markets. We have 96 of them in the no institution, 96 in the gender blind market chief, and 96 in the gender blind small claims court. Okay, that's our first experiment. Entrepreneurs across 16 markets, randomization within markets, and anonymous play. People don't know who they're playing with. Okay, you don't need all this. Okay, so this is the main thing from the first experiment. So when you have the control setting, the men are much more trusting than the women are. That completely reverses when you give them access to a chief. And so the women become trusting when they have access to this chief who will force the guy to give back money if they complain. I mean, they aren't guaranteed that the chief will send the money, but we did in fact use their chief, and we told them that you will send this message to your chief, and your chief has the power to do something. This is what happens. The increase is larger actually in markets with biased chiefs. So we go from and this is, keep in mind, this is the gender blind chief. But when we compare those markets that like people have experience with a biased chief versus those with an unbiased chief, when we tell them they're giving you to access to a gender blind chief, that has the larger impact on trust. Trustworthiness doesn't really change. So like people are still keeping the amount. And actually in our sample, the women are less trustworthy than the men are. The women's trust less, but they also are less trustworthy. Access to the chief's ruling reduces increases trust, increases outcomes for the women. The next thing we did, which is kind of fascinating, at least for me, is we gave women access to the ability to choose a gender blind versus non-gender blind case. We took entrepreneurs across 12 markets. We randomized within markets. And unlike experiment 1, gender is made salient for both treatment and control. So if you complain, your identity will be completely anonymous. Your complaint will be submitted via form. Besides your choices in player B's choice, the chair will not know anything about you or player B. This is the non-gender, that's the gender is not made salient. And the second one, beside your choice in player B's choice, the form shows that the complaint comes from a businessman or businesswoman. Okay. Okay. So women want their gender to be revealed, which we found totally fascinating. We found that shocking, and they particularly want it with low bias chiefs. And so this is when the men, so this is the question as to whether or not you want your gender to be revealed, and there the women actually do want it, and they particularly want it when the bias is below. So this is just, we're just asking preferences on your preference for blindness or not. Then on average, revelation increases when the chief is gender aware, or the chief knows them. That's going to have a larger impact on women's trust. So actually the gender aware chiefs are going to do more to yield trust. And the advantage of knowing the genders is inversely related between the genders. So the chiefs who are particularly good for women, like who want the women really want to be known at, and who are good for the women, they're actually bad for the men, and vice versa. So they're sort of we don't actually believe they're sort of gender biased. We actually believe that they take their traditional job of protecting the weak as being more serious. And chiefs are more likely to take action for women in markets where the women really want them to know their gender. So that's unsurprisingly true as well. I'm going to move on. There's just too much stuff here. But like our conclusions from this is that vulnerability to expropriation can limit market exchanges, as well as creative or entrepreneurial partnerships. In Lusaka, we find substantial gender gaps in trust and business cooperations. And when formal legal systems are weak or inaccessible, informal adjudicators like chiefs can aid. And oddly, like the right answer is often not to gender blind this institution. Often the sort of in context institution is actually like, it's better when they know that they're women. And there is this sort of protector chief thing, which feels like it's important. So I will stop. That's a lot of stuff. And I will stop there. But you can see the space that I'm in on this. And we're just trying to figure out how to get stuff to enable, both women to sort of engage in more collaboration in a way that's safe for them, but also to sort of like get cities to work for people and to get cities to work for the vulnerable. And so that's where we are on that. And our work on small claims court, so people know about the smallest claims court, they aren't using it, even though it's sort of meant particularly for them. And at least one hypothesis is it's seen as sort of going to complain to the dean. So the dean is there. If you're in a faculty setting, you can complain to the dean. But if you complain to the dean, everyone's going to think you're a jerk. And so if you're in an equilibrium that sort of says nobody complains to the dean, then nobody's going to complain to the dean. And so the way we're thinking about it is, can you get to a situation in which going to the small claims court is not seen as being some violation of the community norm, but rather as something that is sort of like an ordinary part of dispute resolution that can be kind of helpful. And certainly that's what this small claims court aspires to do. So that I'll shut up now. That's my riffing on this lengthy topic. But it's been sort of a fascinating sort of attempt to sort of think about how gender relates to the city in different ways.
So I have one comment on that. I'd rather have two comments. One is that I think it also applies to the use of cities in general, like use of city space, right? So if you're a woman, you're probably more vulnerable to certain crimes, criminal activity. And so you might respond by, avoiding certain situations, avoiding certain routes. So me and a colleague
For
now
sure.
have
For sure. Female, like women, particularly in more traditional societies, women using various forms of public transit, that's an active area of research. Women only train cars in Delhi is a thing. Like it's not a thing I'm sure is right, but it's and I'm sorry, that I don't know if I should have said something else on this, but but I think we have to do work on this. I just can't see that we're not going to do. But yes, the protection on this is really important, and figuring out different experiments that actually work on this is important.
Yeah, another comment I would have is that I think it relates to your work in general on institutions, and then what I really get from your work is that what the right institutions are is very context specific, right? So that
For sure.
it's not always
For sure.
you don't
For sure.
always want the same type of institutions
Absolutely.
everywhere.
I mean, we
And
would never think of yeah, it's important for the judge to know the gender of the person in the U.S. That would be a
yeah,
crazy thing to say in a U.S. context. Like in a Zambian context, it may be exactly the right thing to say. And so you really got to pay some respect to this, otherwise it just doesn't work on this stuff. And that's one part of what makes it so fascinating is you were trying to understand how to make things better in these different areas. The you know the there are, I will say one thing when the risk of further triggering, that there are only two things that I believe in that are hardwired between the genders. One of which is the greater male proclivity towards violence, which has been shown in every society ever known, right? That men are more violent than women. The second is greater female altruism towards own children, okay, which is not universal, but it's pretty high. And like, I adore my three kids. Like, I really, but like, there's no way that I would be willing to do what my wife does for all three of them on a regular basis. And but the greater male proclivity to violence is what lies behind what you're talking about in terms of why it is that the genders experience city spaces differently. And it's just a sort of universal kind of thing.
I'm just wondering about making expectations realistic around these issues of social interaction between the genders, because I think it's a stretch, having been around a few years now, to expect people of a certain generation to flip and switch and become someone else. And so when you say, we're working at making things better, should we be expecting the next generation 10 years behind or 10 years behind to be the better people, as opposed to the people who have already set in their ways to trust and interact and be generous with their time to those of other genders? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yes, but remember, I'm an economist, so I actually don't think I have any capacity to make anybody better ever, right? I think we're talking about putting rules in place that stop bad people from being bad, right? So it's not like I think that like these chiefs are somehow they're great because they turn bad men into good men in terms of like changing their heart. They just wrap their knuckles harder if they behave badly. And yes, I do believe that even older people, when they're sufficiently punished for misbehavior, can learn not to engage in misbehavior. It does not make them into a good person, but it can teach them that this is like, let's not do this because I keep on getting in trouble for this. And if the chief is saying, you know what, you have to take a month away from my market, like for this misbehavior, the guy's gonna like think twice about doing that. So I think that's how I think about this. I'm not at all. I'm with you. I don't believe in like I never think that I can change people, and certainly like but I do think you can put rules in place that stop people from misbehaving, and I also think like to be clear, I also am a heavy believer like there's plenty of good and evil in all of us, including myself. Right? It's not like I'm sitting around here saying, "Oh, this is terrible that men have a proclivity towards violence." I mean, like I'm part of this as well. I'm not sitting around hating my gender or anything, but like this is a realistic picture of what we are on this stuff. So it's and there's that proclivity towards violence also gave us D-Day. Okay, so it's not like I'm going to sit here and hate us for that, but it does mean that like we need to design things that are slightly different. Is that fair, Victoria? Are we on the same place, or does your? There's also questions like, do you really think you can change institutions in Zambia? That also requires a fair amount of hubris. But like that one, I'm willing to go on.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily change. I just think that some institutions, people expect an immediate return or an immediate response. And these are like generational issues, or these are, like infrastructure, to build out infrastructure in real estate, it's 25 years. And so if there's a boom in a labor market in a city and they need workers now, there's no way you're going to catch up quickly. So that's just a rift between two institutions that you have to solve and go forward with that knowledge. And so I guess I was presenting it more in the sense of, female-male relationship issues aren't going to be an immediate resolution. And so how you break down the timing and the categories might be more easy to see the positive outcomes rather than just dwelling in the negative.
So remember where, like, I agree with that completely. And I don't think of us as dwelling in the negatives on this thing. I think we're thinking about like we're trying to enable collaboration, and that is the positive side of this. But it's sort of part of my punishment agenda, which is and that's part of being an economist, and it's part of actually not believing that I know how to change people. So, for example, there are a whole bunch of open street defecation is a problem, particularly in India. And There are a bunch of people who think that they can change the culture of Indian cities to change open street defecation. By all means, they should try to do that. But I'm an economist. I don't know how to change culture. I know how to punish people. And so, like, my strategy for dealing with open street defecation, particularly for kids, is I want to punish them by making them do math problems in community centers. Which, like, I don't think that's going to do them any harm, but I think many of them will find it a deterrent, and that's kind of what I want to do, is to sort of. And I'm intrigued by my eldest son, who was, like, because he was a relatively large kid, was under strict rules. He was never allowed to, like, harm any of his younger siblings in any way. And he by and large, in all his years, was incredibly gentle and good soul on this. But he would frequently start running around saying, "Dad, we need some punishment here, Dad. We need some punishment here." Which is and I think there is something on this. The second thing I would just say, like, I'm an academic, right? And so fundamentally I'm curiosity driven, which means, like, my hunger to have an immediate policy fix is non-existent, right? So I mentioned that I started working on housing supply issues in the US a solid more than 25 years ago, okay? And on one level, it's been a very gratifying thing, because when I started, there was like 2 libertarian economists who didn't think I was wasting my time. And, 2 years ago, Barack Obama was talking about local land use regulation on the floors of the DNC. And I had a whole bunch of guys who went to the Trump White House who were excited about making progress on this issue as well. Now, on one level, it's been great, because I think we've kind of won, and this abundance thing is a thing which draws very heavily on papers that I've written over the years, right? And that's deeply reassuring. On the other hand, the reason why there's an abundance thing is that for 25 years, I've had absolutely no success whatsoever on changing this. So, like, that's something I'm used to. Now, there are, like, we did get this kind of crappy Build Now Act in the recent housing thing, and I guess I can take some pride in that. But I will also say the reason why I got involved with the senators when they wanted me to do this was I wanted to understand how legislation worked more than I was confident that I could actually make America better. Because fundamentally, I'm driven by trying to understand the way the world is, and I have a sort of, like, belief that somehow or other, by educating the world about itself, I can make it in a better place. But that's not like an immediate play. That's a play that, like, knowledge is valuable in the very long haul. And so, like, there's not a lot of me that's saying, "Oh boy, can I fix this tomorrow?" And there's not a lot of me that's like, remember, we're economists also, in the sense that, like, moral judgmentalism is not our thing. Like, we're deeply interested in humanity. And I think actually, like, one of the lessons for this book that I'm writing on the history of housing supply in the US is something that one of our 5 big things is something we call the virtuous actor fallacy, which is that you judge policies by the virtue of the person who does it. And I think that's a terrible mistake, right? That in fact, often terrible things are done by really good people, including much of land use regulation in California, which was done by incredibly good people, but has done a lot of pernicious things. Whereas William Levitt, who was like a horrible guy on his racial covenants, right? He built a lot of housing for ordinary people that did a lot of good in this world. And so I think actually, like, moral judgmentalism is rarely helpful on stuff. And in fact, I will also just say, on, like, saying stuff about guys, I trust that people understand that I'm not self-hating. And I will say that none of my female co-authors will be as blunt about men as I am. That they will be much more subtle about various things, whereas I'm kind of happy to call us the way that we are, and with a great deal of love for us, as well as a certain amount of recognition of what our failings are. Anna, you've had your hand up for a long time.
So I would like to challenge you on whether economists can change the world. I am a very pro-economist person. This is just my genetic proclivity for this. I think you're making me think that, like, sorry, I will go back a step. One thing that really bothers me about trying to tackle the gender question, especially in my industry, is obviously women want to be equal, but also women seem to be needing some kind of extra layers of personal, relational, and institutional protection so that we can just, like, do our work on the minimum basis. Like, we're always starting, like, a little bit lower, a little bit defensive. And when you look at the giant competition, obviously, if I have to spend 20% of my time on dealing with the fact that I'm a woman, then other people who don't have to deal with this will outcompete me, right? Like, all these things are, like, lowering the chances of you being able to just, like, do your work. But I never know how to deal with this, because how am I equal if I also need, like, extra stuff? Like, now I'm asking a man to do extra work, right, to protect me or deal with me fairly, which also, like, lowers his own specialization allocation or how to deal with it. But I think if I reframe it, and this is where economists come into play, or at least like game theory, if I reframe the whole thing as cooperation, then the whole thing makes sense, right? Like, how can you create a game where the people
That's right.
wanting to contribute want to cooperate?
That's right. That's right. And it's just an issue of having everyone have the ability to protect themselves in a cooperative relationship. And it's not just like, I think we've talked about gender, but it's true for any sort of power imbalance, right? And it's not like the if the weak will not collaborate with the strong because they're afraid of stuff, it's not like that's good for the strong either. Right? The strong actually want to be able to collaborate with the weak. So in fact, everybody wins when we set up a situation in which there are rules that are enforced. And that's I'm not saying economists. I believe in my profession profoundly, and I mean believe in this. Spent my life in this thing, and I love it. So I'm not pushing back at all. I'm just agreeing with Victoria that change is slow, and you shouldn't expect everything to happen automatically. I will also say that once you are talking about like your industry, then we're back in the world in which says like hyper local institutions matter. And I wouldn't take I think there are things that come from Zambia that are relevant everywhere, but and that everyone needs to be able to cooperate without fear of expropriation or abuse. But like what that means in terms of the right institution is going to be very different in different contexts. And I will say in terms of, when I was department chair, I popped in on Economists for Equity, which is actually used to be the Women's Economics Association group in Harvard Economics Department, but it changed its name to E4E. And one of them, as I said, what can I do for you? What's particularly useful? And one of them said, you can get all the faculty members to put their him, her things on their Zoom stuff. And I said, I'm absolutely not doing anything of that form whatsoever. First of all, like I'm into individual freedom. I'm not in favor of regulating anything like this. And secondly, I actually believe that like the only identity that matters in this building is we're all economists, right? Your gender does not actually matter within here. Like you're an economist, and we've been fighting for that for a long time, and I'm not going backwards on that. And so I don't believe that highlighting your gender identification does any good. If you want to put economist after your name, I'm game for that, because that's the identification that we want to be emphasizing. And that didn't seem to get me. I would say the majority of women in this group actually thought that was a helpful response, not a negative response. Although the actual person who said get their pronouns up was not pleased with that. But
I mean, look, I built this company 10 years ago, right? For 7.5 years already. There is a platform where we designed a real-time system of cooperation that I researched and designed, because of which we've had 7.5 years of conversation that is, as you can see, barely moderated. Oftentimes I'm not there. I'm just like, I dropped in because I like you guys. And they had zero incident on our platform. So obviously these notions, it's like in conversation design, how to make it like, I don't like weak. I think we're not weak, right? Like the analogy in a conversation would be the introverts. Like, I don't want to be at a conversation where a genius introvert who just doesn't have to happen to genetically have the kind of confidence or experiences or whatever, we don't want to lose out on it, right? So you design these things where, and having an external topic, like, the conversations about Dostoevsky or cities and cooperation helps people kind of like put these little personal idiosyncrasies aside. So I think there's something very algorithmic about it.
Yep, totally. I agree with that.
Very quick question on going back to the Zamibian slides. So I don't know if I missed this, but was there a statistics on whether the women trust government, like the trust in the government infrastructures? Is there anything related to that?
We're focusing on trust for other people, trust for strangers, trust in business. There's no part on trust in government in what we're doing. It is true that like trust in government is pretty low, and it should be low. I mean, I remember when 30 years ago or 25 years ago, Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone was a very big deal in social science. And Joe Nye declared when he was dean of the Kennedy School that like he thought increasing Americans' trust in government was the most important thing, which seemed completely wrong to me. I thought, in fact, like what we wanted to do was increase the trustworthiness of government for sure. But in fact, I don't want people to be uncritical about governments. In fact, most of the time I want them to be quite critical about things that their leaders are telling them. I have this line that which is sort of my somewhat libertarian side of this is my father grew up in Hitler's Germany and my grandfather grew up in the Tsar's Russia, and I have my doubts about the benevolence of government. So it's a and so I'm sort of not on the trusting side on governments, but one can get data on this, Amy. So it's not a hard thing to research if one's interested in doing it. And I certainly believe we should strive to make governments more trustworthy. And I also will say, just pushing back on what I just said, like I think America spent too much time on the bigger government versus smaller government over the last 50 years relative to like the better government. And I think my mission on public sector efficiency is all about the better government side, not about shrinking or expanding government. Like paving the rough roads before we pave the smooth roads.
Yeah. By the way, I'm reminded by this the foreword you wrote for this book co containing unpublished writings of Gary Becker, and that was edited by Kevin Murphy and Casey Mulligan, I believe. And I like the forward a lot because you expressed, that there was, Friedman and the old guys, and then the next generation, like Becker, they were more open to actually improving government with the right incentives. And then I think you're even more into that direction than he was, I guess.
Part of it is my specialty in being an urban guy. Which is in the same sense that I don't think there's this, there may not be an atheist in a foxhole. If you start praying when the bombs are loading, there's no such thing as a sensible, pure libertarian in a city, in the sense that like cities need management and they need public management because they're the level of, what we call externalities, but just different ways in which people can impact each other negatively through traffic congestion or contagion or other things. They're so rife that those things need management. And that's just the way of things. Trey, you've had your hand up for a while, but we've got to start close. I've got a 4 o'clock thing, so we should be slowing down to closing up. But I will give a fulsome response to whatever Trey.
Yeah, your old book. I was gonna say if you were gonna rewrite it today, because I think it was written about 15 years ago, would you do anything different? Or is there anything you wish you had done different?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to write it for a different time. I've never been tempted to go back and redo it. I'm trying to think of what, like, I probably would put in. I don't know that I would do anything different. I mean, I think the things that I wrote about are things that I believed then and I kind of still believe now. There was a certain sense in which I regretted. I think I did not realize when I tried to sell parts of the book outside of the East Coast about how toxic saying that there were like that climate change was a thing was in different parts of the country. I wouldn't have like gone against that. I would have figured out how to be slightly more smart about that in terms of not coding as being blue state completely on this. I'm not sure there's anything that I feel all that. There is a typo where I got Levitt's first name wrong. I'd like to fix that one. But I don't think there's anything major that I would go against on that. I mean, I did less. So both the last book, Survival of the City, and the one that I'm working on now, which is a much more fulsome thing, which is the history of housing supply in the U.S., how we manufactured scarcity in a land of abundance. There, like this one, I'm much more like I feel like I need to rely on primary sources much more than I did for Triumph. And so, like that's changed my style. It's not obvious it makes the books any better, but somehow I feel more respectable when I read the Congressional Register from 1944 instead of doing other stuff. So,
thank you.
I have a very quick question.
Yes, sir.
Mom Donna, yay or nay?
Too early to tell. Too early to tell. The whole question is how he governs. Like, I mean, the rhetoric is the rhetoric, and guys say all sorts of silly things. I mean, it's and obviously, like, you can't govern the way that he talked, but he's not going to govern the way that he talked. He can't govern the way that he talked, and so we've got to see what happens. His deputy mayor is, I think, seen as being a pretty good manager, and his embrace on some kind of like local efficiency thing is kind of positive looking. So I think we're going to have to see. I mean, like, I mean, obviously, I sort of, I'm not of the socialist ilk. as I think everyone's figured out by this point in time. But you can't really be a socialist mayor that's not and do the things that socialists want to do that are sort of really problematic, or else rich people start leaving. And there is a, the sewer socialists in Milwaukee did a pretty great job of running the city for 30 years with good management. Fiorello LaGuardia was briefly a socialist, and he was a pretty good mayor in New York. So I think this fundamental fact that there's no Democratic or Republican way to clean up the streets means that ideology just matters less at the local level, and so we'll just have to see how he governs. There is actually a fact that goes on this, which is you compare close elections, people who Democrats who win by 1% versus Republicans who win by 1%, they do the same things when they're mayors, right? The ideology of the person doesn't matter. That, of course, is not true for senators, representatives, presidents, or even governors, but the mayors kind of do the same thing precisely because of this LaGuardia quote about, there's only one way to clean up. There's no ideological thing about street cleaning.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And we'll see. It's great. So I think it's 4:00, and I think I have to get back to my real job.
Yeah. Okay. So we should wrap this up. So thank you, Ed, for being here. I think it was pretty fun, and we learned a lot.
It was fun.
Hopefully, we learned a lot. All of you. I mean, I heard some of that you presenting it in Budapest a few months ago, but I was still interested in what you see about, because a lot of it is evolving. I think it's a work in progress, like your gender stuff. And I wanted to people hear about things some of your newer stuff, like some of your latest stuff, like this road roughness agenda, because I think obviously you talked much more about your older stuff in earlier interviews and talks and so on, but I wanted people to look at these papers and to hear about these papers. So thank you again for being here, and
my pleasure.
hope
Absolutely.
It was fun for you as well.
It was fun. It was fun for me.
Okay.
It feels like a guilty pleasure because I'm not working, but it certainly was a pleasure. So,
all right. And so thanks for everyone for being here and for choosing us, and wish everyone a happy,
Thanks.
Well, everyone is in different time zones, so yeah.
Bye-bye.